Hey all, Lisa Marriott here. This week we're going to be talking about buildings and health, and so I wanted to bring a few things up to your forefront. So as you're reading through, just keep a few of these things in mind. So what we typically see when we are reading our textbook is that Frumkin is saying that we're spending about 90% of our time in buildings, either at home or at work. And if you've ever seen Dan Buettner, he does a beautiful TED Talk on blue zones, and he's talking about how 80% of our life is spent within a 20-mile radius. So our built environment makes a huge difference in how we spend our time, our overall health, and the people that are around us, how everything kind of fits together. If you haven't seen his TED Talk, I highly recommend it. It will give you some perspective and make you want to walk a little bit more. But the reason that I bring this up is because our built environment matters. And the reason that it matters is we've been talking about epigenetics a lot and how our environmental exposures and our experiences, the things that we do within our life, how they affect how our DNA works. And some of the things that really seem to make a big difference are our stress levels, the air quality, so the things around us, our nutrition, and I've put sleep in parentheses because this is kind of a new area. We know if we don't sleep, we die, but how sleep is affecting our health and how it's affecting epigenetics is still a pretty new area of science, which is pretty exciting, so stay tuned for that. But as you go through, and so this is from the California EPA, there's lots of things that are inside our homes or inside our buildings that are going to affect our health. And this is a list. It's pretty extensive, but you can see that there are quite a few things that are going to affect that. So it could be things that are in carpets, it could be things that are, off-gassing from paints or in the walls, all over the place. And the reason that I want to bring this up is because there's some other things for you to keep in mind as well. So we're going to be talking a little bit about mold this week, and essentially mold and moisture go hand in hand. So you're going to see that a lot when buildings are a little bit older, and you're also going to see it a lot with disasters. So Hurricane Katrina or any sort of major disaster where there's a lot of water infiltration. So essentially what they're trying to do is keep mold out of buildings, but again, nature finds a way, right? So often you'll find mold in areas that you can't see, so it might be behind refrigerators or desks or things that have been there for a while in bathrooms. And then they talk about, this is from the EPA, about how to actually protect yourself as you're removing it if it's in a small contained area. If it's in a larger area, then they recommend pulling in an expert. But there are no regulations for what is the amount of mold that is a threshold, for example. So like if you see, are there any federal regulations? There are no threshold limits for mold or mold spores. So it's kind of, it's no man's land at this point. So something to keep in mind. The other part that I really want you to keep in mind is this. And this pulls us back to epigenetics. So I've put two websites at the very bottom, these two videos. Both of them talk about the same thing. So this is a map of Baltimore and redlining. And if you don't know about redlining, I highly recommend it, especially when you're thinking about social determinants of health. So this group, the California Newsreel folks, they've done a series of videos on race. And why it matters is right here. So I'm pulling this over from YouTube. And hopefully this will work exactly how I want it to. Perfect. All right. I'm going to just stay quiet for a little bit. This is a 6-minute video, but what I want you to see is about 1 minute and 10 seconds or so. Enjoy.
Starting in the 1930s, government officials institutionalized a national appraisal system where race was as much a factor in real estate assessment as the condition of the property. Using this scheme, federal investigators evaluated 239 cities across the country for financial risk.
So that those communities that were all white, suburban, and far away from minority areas, they received the highest rating, and that was the color green. Those communities that were all minority or in the process of changing, they got the lowest rating and the color red. They were redlined. As a consequence, most of the mortgages went to suburbanizing America, and it suburbanized it racially.
As homes in white communities appreciated in value, the net worth of these white families grew. For most non-white families who stayed in urban neighborhoods, the housing market open to them in the 50s and 60s was largely a rental market. You don't gain equity by paying rent.
Where one?
So I want to pause right there because I feel that this offers a really interesting perspective of the things that happened in the past and how they're going to affect future health. So what we know about epigenetics and what we know about developmental origins of disease, if these individuals experienced not as equal housing, they might be experiencing greater mold and greater asthma, things along those lines for longer periods of time. Also, we've heard a lot about some of these stressors so in disasters, in other circumstances when there's rapid change. So for example, in climate change, we talked about the increase in mental health when in times of displacement. This is an example of displacement that happened in the past. So based on what we know about climate change, based on what we know of epigenetics, based on what we know about everything else, what would you expect here with regard to mold, other issues, and effects of wealth on health? So things to keep in mind as you're going through and reading. Also, this one. Okay, so I was curious about the effects of mold compared to socioeconomics, and it doesn't take very long to find that, yes, of course, there is an association between socioeconomics and mold, where lower overall socioeconomic position is associated with higher mold. They also look at it related to socioeconomics and asthma and several others. But overall, it's looking like the older the home, which is associated with lower income, these are health risks for people. So things to keep in mind there as well. So we're building our School of Public Health, which is wonderful. And a lot of buildings are moving towards healthier options to move forward. So for example, for our school, they're looking at, increased walkability. So they're really focusing on the stairs as a primary way of moving throughout the building. They're also looking at the materials being used, which is wonderful. So it's going to be about 200 square feet. Very exciting. But here's what I want you to consider. So LEED is a group that looks at how green a building is, which is wonderful. Here's the issue though. As you're going through, let me pull this up. As you're going through, and this is the LEED website and certification fees. So in order for you to be LEED Platinum or LEED Gold, you have to follow a certain set of criteria and rules. But it doesn't come without it doesn't come without cost, pardon me. So for example, if you're going to be building something, there's a registration fee, and then there's a flat fee per building. And then, all right, so we're about 200 square feet for the School of Public Health, so there's also a certain rate and minimum. All right, so that's for building design and construction. But when you go down, you can see there's a lot of other fees as well, just depending on what the project is. So here's for interior design and construction. Same thing. Building operation and maintenance. Neighborhood development, and then homes. So based on what we see previously, how are lower income builders or lower income individuals going to have the same LEED certification? So what I hear is that there are a lot of groups that are following the LEED guidelines but not going for the certification because it's too expensive. Same thing for some of the organic farmers. They're still practicing the organic practices without actually going for certification. So for the health management and policy folks, think about those things. So if you're requiring you're requiring the certification for LEED or organic in order for tax credits and some of these other pieces, those certification fees make a big difference and they matter. So I'm going to leave it to you to figure out how to actually implement it, but there are things for you to keep in mind as you go forward. So where I want to end is with health impact assessments. So this is still a pretty new area, which is really exciting, but essentially all they're doing is using data to inform decisions. And one of your required readings is through Dannenberg. He's in the Pacific Northwest, and he talks about different types of health impact assessments, and some can be used for process, for impact, or for outcomes, where you're actually measuring the health outcomes of an individual as a result of the policy that you do. There's going to be more in that article. But if you look at the CDC website, they talk about what is included in some of these health impact assessments, and they're just what you would expect. So it's like, who's at risk, what's happening, what are the recommendations, what would you expect for this or this or this or this, and it goes on from there. They're usually voluntary, so this is something to consider. And so we saw this again when we were in water, and so they did the environmental impact assessment, but then they cut it short and just moved forward with things. So there are things to keep in mind. There are trade-offs for pros and cons. And in Dannenberg's, I recognize this is a busy slide, so I apologize for that. But the nice thing is it's all common sense. So when they're talking about, what makes a health impact assessment successful, meaning that, policy decisions were impacted by this assessment, it's pulling the right people involved, making sure things are done timely, engaging, getting support from your policymakers, making sure you're clear in what you're describing. This is all science education, science communication of why things matter. So this is why we were hammering on all of these things. And then they talk about some challenges. So if you don't have enough time, that's going to be a problem. People aren't going to listen to you if they don't have enough time to do so, or time to incorporate your suggestions into their findings. So make sure you give plenty of time. Make sure you also don't use a lot of jargon. So if you're using a bunch of words that no one's going to understand, they're probably not going to use your words to move forward. So it all comes back to the way we communicate. So look forward to seeing you all in class. Have a great weekend.